Some men walk into a room and demand attention. Others walk in and change it. Harrison Ford wasn't dressed to impress that day at Lax. No bodyguard, no tailored suit, no fanfare. Just an old canvas backpack and a calm presence that didn't match the luxury around him. But one man saw only the flannel shirt and made the mistake of assuming that's all there was. What happened next turned a quiet flight into a lesson no one in that cabin would forget. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with its usual rhythm. Luggage wheels echoing on marble floors, departure announcements humming overhead, and tired travelers shuffling in every direction. Among them, at the far end of the first-class check-in line, stood a man who looked like he had wandered in from another era. A plaid shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal weathered forearms, faded jeans. A canvas backpack that had clearly seen better days and perhaps better places. His boots were scuffed, not by fashion but by life, and he stood there quietly, not scrolling through a phone, not checking his watch, just being. The staff didn't give him the usual nod reserved for VIPs, the crowd didn't part, and yet something about his presence seemed grounded, like the calm in the eye of a storm. A few feet behind him in line was a sharply dressed man in his mid-30s. Tailored navy suit, shining shoes, and a watch that likely cost more than most people's cars. His name was Trevor Langston, and he carried himself like someone who believed the world owed him an upgrade. He scrolled through his phone with one hand, sipping espresso with the other, eyes darting, scanning, evaluating, judging. And then they landed on the man in plaid. Trevor's brow lifted, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. First class, really? He didn't say it, not yet, but his expression spoke volumes. A moment later, a small voice cut through the crowd. "Mom, isn't that?" a young girl whispered, tugging her mother's sleeve and pointing forward. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes widened for a second. She quickly pulled the girl's hand down. "No, sweetie, don't point, just don't bother him." The girl frowned, confused, but obeyed. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, unnoticed by most, except Trevor, who raised an eyebrow, now more curious than ever. He glanced again at the man in plaid. There was something in the way he stood, not slouched, but relaxed, like someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The line moved forward. The man stepped ahead with the same unhurried grace, nodding politely to the attendant. Trevor followed, rolling his sleek carbon fiber carry-on, still watching. He leaned slightly, speaking just loud enough to be heard. "Not the usual first-class look," he said with a half-laugh. The man turned slightly. His face was lined, eyes steady, voice quiet. "Comfort looks different to everyone," he said, not unkindly. Trevor tilted his head. That voice, there was something about it. Familiar, almost, but he dismissed it. Probably just another retired rancher flying to Montana or Colorado or wherever men like that disappear to. Still, he watched as the man received his boarding pass, nodded, and moved towards security. No entourage, no noise, just presence, as if he belonged there in a way no suit ever could. Trevor smiled to himself. "This'll be interesting," he muttered, more amused than annoyed. He had no idea just how right he was. The air inside the first-class cabin was cool and quiet, muffled by luxury. Cream leather seats lined the aisle like thrones, each one spaced with intent, as if to remind passengers they were not like the rest. Trevor Langston boarded with confidence, flashing his boarding pass with the kind of smile that expected recognition. He didn't get it, but he was used to that. Not everyone could appreciate success when they saw it. As he made his way down the aisle, he scanned seat numbers with the ease of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Then he paused. Seat 2A, and right there in 2B, already settled in with that same calm stillness, was the man in the plaid shirt. Trevor blinked, then almost chuckled to himself. "Of course," he muttered, "out of all the seats on this plane." The man, Harrison, looked up with a slight nod, as if he'd been expecting him. No surprise, no judgment, just that steady, unreadable calm. Trevor stowed his carry-on above with a practiced motion and dropped into the seat beside him. He loosened his tie just slightly and leaned back, glancing sideways with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nice to see first class is getting inclusive," he said, voice light, almost joking. Harrison turned his head, studied him for a moment, then looked back out the window. "Seems that way." Trevor laughed softly, as if expecting more. When nothing came, he pressed on. "Don't get me wrong," he said, shifting in his seat. "Everyone else got their story. I just didn't expect to have company that wasn't, banking, tech, politics, the usual suspects. Still no bite, just that same steady presence." Eventually, Trevor tried a different angle. "So what do you do, if you don't mind me asking?" Harrison looked at him, not offended, not amused, just thoughtful. "I used to work with my hands," he said simply, "built a few things, fixed a few more. These days, I fly a bit." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Fly, like you mean commercial?" "No," Harrison said, "smaller planes, bush flying, some mountain work, rescue occasionally." Trevor blinked, then laughed. "Well, that's something you don't hear every day. I figured maybe, I don't know, HVAC guy, retired military maybe. You've got that kind of vibe, not the flying type." Harrison didn't respond to that. Instead, he adjusted the strap of his worn canvas bag beneath the seat and settled in, as if the conversation was already over. Trevor tapped the armrest, trying to place the man. He wasn't just another small-town retiree, he thought. There was something too calm about him, too sure. Still, he couldn't resist one more jab. "I mean, hey, good for you," he said, smirking. "Not everyone gets to ride first. Gotta admit, you don't exactly look the part." Harrison turned, finally meeting Trevor's eyes fully. "Maybe the part's not what matters," he said. "Maybe it's just the journey." The line hung in the air longer than expected. Trevor looked away first, scoffing under his breath. "Right, the journey." He glanced toward the flight attendant as she moved down the aisle, greeting passengers. He smiled, nodded, back in control. But inside, something unsettled had started to stir. He couldn't explain it. He didn't like it. Next to him, the man in the plaid shirt closed his eyes, not to sleep, but as if to say, "I don't need to win this moment. I've already won something else." Trevor shifted again, suddenly aware that despite everything he wore, everything he carried, he was the one feeling out of place. The plane leveled out above the clouds, and the subtle hum of engines replaced the rush and rustle of boarding. The first-class cabin dimmed, bathed in soft gold light. Passengers settled into their seats, wrapped in the comfort of altitude and exclusivity. A flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform moved gracefully down the aisle, a silver tray in hand. She offered a warm smile as she approached seats 2A and 2B. "Welcome aboard, gentlemen. May I offer you a drink to start? We have Krug Grand Cuvée, fresh from the cellar." Trevor sat up straighter. His smile widened, loud enough to be noticed, calculated without effort. "Absolutely," he said, gesturing with the flair of someone used to being served. "I'll have the Krug, big pour if you don't mind. Life's too short for half glasses." The attendant nodded politely, pouring the champagne into fine crystal. Trevor turned slightly, made sure the label on the bottle faced the cabin. "You ever tried this?" he asked Harrison. "Retails for about $800 a bottle, tastes like success." Harrison glanced up, eyes calm, almost amused. "No, I haven't." The attendant turned to him next. "And for you, sir?" "Just water, please," Harrison replied, his tone as easy as it was unshakable. Trevor blinked, then laughed short, sharp enough to draw attention. "Water?" he said, raising his glass. "Come on, you're in first class. You're allowed to enjoy it." "I am," Harrison said, accepting the bottle of water with a nod. "This is what I enjoy." Trevor chuckled again, louder this time. "Haven't seen anyone waste a seat like that in a while." A few passengers nearby glanced over. Some turned back quickly, others lingered a moment longer. Harrison didn't flinch. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip, his movements slow and deliberate. Trevor leaned back, still smiling but with an edge in his voice. "You know, people usually come up here for the experience, not just the transportation. Otherwise, what's the point?" Harrison looked at him. "Maybe the point isn't the seat," he said softly. "Maybe it's the distance." Trevor didn't reply. He stared ahead, chewing on the words without meaning to, then shook his head. "You sound like some kind of guru," he muttered. Next thing you'll be telling me is that happiness isn't in the bubbles. Harrison didn't answer. He didn't need to. The flight attendant returned with warm towels. Trevor took his and made a show of wiping his hands with exaggerated precision. "Don't get me wrong," he said, half to the attendant, half to Harrison. "Everyone's got their thing. But first class used to mean something. Now it's just open access, credit cards and loyalty points, guys in flannel shirts." Harrison looked at him again, not with offense, not even pity. Just the kind of quiet that made words feel louder than intended. "You seem to care a lot about how other people fly," he said, folding the towel neatly. Trevor shrugged. "I care about standards, presentation. You know, success should look like success." Harrison gave a faint smile. Sometimes success is quiet. Sometimes it doesn't need to be seen to be real. The cabin grew a little quieter. Conversations dipped. A woman across the aisle glanced up from her book, eyes flicking toward the exchange. A man 2 rows ahead adjusted in his seat, listening without turning around. Trevor took another sip of champagne, this time less sure of himself. The bubbles seemed sharper. He cleared his throat. "Well," he said, voice lighter than before, "to each their own." Harrison nodded once. "Exactly." And with that, he returned to the clouds outside the window, watching them drift, watching the sky open wider. Trevor sat back, the silence between them louder than any toast. For the first time he wondered, not about the man's clothes or his drink choice, but about the space he held. The kind of space you didn't buy, the kind you earned. The cabin had quieted. Most passengers had reclined their seats, lulled by the steady hum of altitude and the comfort of isolation. First class had a way of softening the world, of placing you just far enough above everything to forget the noise below. Trevor Langston sat with his legs crossed, swirling the last of his champagne like it was liquid gold. The man beside him, still in that plaid shirt, still drinking water, had barely moved. It unnerved him, though he couldn't explain why. Trevor broke the silence, voice low but deliberate. "You know," he said, "people think first class is just about the seat, the food, the service, but really it's about position, what it says about you, where you've been, what you've earned." Harrison didn't respond at first. He took another sip of water, then looked over with that same unreadable calm. "And what does it say about you?" he asked. Trevor smiled, not missing a beat. "That I worked for this, that I pushed harder than most. Look, I came from nothing. Didn't have a name, no family money, no safety net. I built this life, every deal, every late night, every risk. I earned this seat." Harrison nodded slowly. "And you think others haven't?" Trevor leaned forward slightly. "I think some people stumble into privilege without paying the toll. Luck, inheritance, loopholes. They get handed a seat like this and act like they belong." "And how can you tell who earned it and who didn't?" Harrison asked. Trevor shrugged. "It shows. You can see it in how they act, how they carry themselves. Success has a weight to it. You either wear it or you borrow it." Harrison looked out the window. The clouds now painted with streaks of soft orange as the sun chased them westward. Then he said, without turning back, "Funny thing about flying. No matter what seat you're in, we all land in the same place." Trevor laughed, louder than necessary. "You get that from a napkin quote. One of those little self-help blurbs in the free airport magazine." A few heads turned, not sharply, just enough. An older gentleman across the aisle glanced over his glasses and shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Trevor saw it, saw the subtle shift in atmosphere. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat. "I'm just saying," he muttered, "some people like to wrap mediocrity in wisdom and call it depth." Harrison turned then, not fast, not angry, just with the patience of someone who'd seen 100 storms and waited them all out. "And some people hide their fear in noise," he said. Trevor blinked. "Excuse me. You work hard, that's clear. But sometimes, the louder someone talks about what they've earned, the more they're trying to convince themselves it was enough." Trevor's jaw tightened. The words weren't loud, but they hit harder than any shout. He leaned back, exhaled through his nose, staring at the ceiling of the cabin like it might offer a better answer. "I don't need lectures from someone who drinks water in first class," he muttered. Harrison smiled, just slightly. "No lecture. Just an observation." Another beat of silence passed. Trevor could feel it, how the cabin's attention had subtly shifted, not overt but real, the weight of eyes, the measure of tone. He looked over again, trying to regain control. You talk like someone who's read a lot of books, but never really lived in the fight. That got a response. Harrison's eyes met his, steady and deep. I've been in more fights than you'd imagine, he said. The difference is, I don't wear them like badges, I carry them like lessons. Trevor swallowed. The cabin felt warmer suddenly, smaller. His suit, his champagne, his crafted confidence, they all felt heavier than they had an hour ago. He looked around, noticed again the man across the aisle still watching him, expression unreadable. For the first time, Trevor felt something unfamiliar creeping in. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was discomfort. A growing suspicion that maybe, just maybe, the man beside him wasn't the one out of place after all. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft amber, casting a gentle glow across the first-class section. Most passengers had retreated into their personal cocoons, screens dimmed, books resting on laps, eyes half-closed in the quiet comfort of altitude. But in seats 2A and 2B, something else stirred, silent but rising. Harrison sat with the same calm he'd carried since the beginning, hands resting lightly on his lap, gaze steady on the horizon beyond the window. Trevor, on the other hand, couldn't settle. He shifted in his seat, adjusted his cufflinks, checked his phone though there was no signal, as if searching for something to anchor him. The silence between them had thickened, filled with everything unspoken. Then Harrison spoke, not loud, not accusatory, just a question, simple and soft. Have you ever felt, he said, that the more you try to prove yourself, the emptier it starts to feel inside? Trevor turned sharply, blinking at him like he'd been slapped. What? Harrison met his eyes. That chasing approval doesn't quiet the noise, it just adds to it. Trevor's jaw clenched. I don't feel empty, he snapped. I've built a life, a name, a business, everything I have I earned, every damn cent. I believe you, Harrison said calmly, but that calm was fuel to a fire Trevor couldn't control. He leaned forward, voice rising. You think just because you sit there in your thrift store shirt, sipping water, talking like some monk, you've got it all figured out. You don't know me, you don't know what I've done to get here. The passengers around them began to stir, eyes opened, heads turned. Trevor didn't notice. I've got more in my portfolio than you've probably made in your life, he said louder now. I've got property, cars, people listen when I talk. I've got everything you don't. And then it happened. The crystal glass in Trevor's hand, still half full with champagne, tilted as his arm jerked. Whether it was an accident or a loss of control, no one could say, but the liquid splashed in a wide arc, landing squarely on Harrison's chest. A cold splash of gold against plaid. The entire cabin froze. Someone gasped. A flight attendant paused mid-step. A couple across the aisle stared, mouths slightly open. Time seemed to hold its breath. Trevor blinked, suddenly realizing what he'd done. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Harrison didn't flinch. He looked down at the spreading stain, then reached calmly into his jacket pocket, pulling out a simple handkerchief. He dabbed at the fabric gently, as if it didn't matter at all. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't angry. They were clear, unshaken, measured. You don't need to apologize to me, he said, his voice low but strong. But maybe you owe yourself one. Trevor stared at him, speechless. You keep trying to convince the world you're successful, Harrison continued, but it seems like the person you're trying hardest to convince is you. The cabin remained silent. Even the engines seemed to hush. Trevor looked around. The glances were no longer admiring, no longer curious. They were quiet judgments, gentle disappointments, silent reflections of everything he'd just exposed. He wiped his hands on a napkin, though they weren't wet. His breath was shallow, his face flushed. I didn't mean to, he started, but the sentence fell apart before it found its footing. Harrison didn't respond. He turned back to the window, as if the whole moment had passed like turbulence, brief, expected, and now behind them. But for Trevor, it hadn't passed. It was just beginning. Because in that moment, soaked not just in champagne, but in the weight of his own words, he realized something he couldn't unsee. He hadn't won, not the argument, not the moment. And maybe, just maybe, not even his own story. Not yet. The tension in the cabin had settled into something colder now. Trevor sat stiffly in his seat, no longer the confident man who had boarded with a champagne grin and tailored bravado. His shirt clung slightly to his back, not from sweat, but from something deeper, an awareness, uncomfortable and sharp, that he'd crossed a line he didn't fully understand. Beside him, Harrison remained calm. The stain on his shirt had dried into a muted patch, but he made no move to fuss over it. He simply stared out the window, as if none of it had ever mattered. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then a quiet voice interrupted the silence. "Excuse me, Mr. Ford," the flight attendant said as she approached. Her voice was courteous, but there was a note of reverence beneath it. She leaned in slightly, careful not to disturb the calm that had settled around the two men. "The captain asked me to pass along a message. He sends his regards and says he's still grateful for what you did in Wyoming back in 2001. Your chartered aircraft will be ready for you upon landing." Trevor turned. Ford, he blinked, then slowly turned his head to look at the man beside him. The name echoed in his mind over and over. Ford, not just Ford. He squinted, as if trying to make sense of a riddle that had been in front of him the entire time. "Harrison Ford," he said aloud, but the words came out like a question to himself more than anyone else. The man beside him didn't answer immediately. He just offered a small, polite smile, the kind that said yes without needing to say anything at all. Trevor's lips parted, but nothing came out. The pieces clicked together in an instant. The voice, the presence, the calm, the eyes that looked like they'd seen decades of both chaos and quiet. You're him," Trevor muttered. "Indiana Jones, the pilot. You rescued people. That was real." Harrison nodded slightly, the smile still faint on his lips. "I just did what needed doing," he said. Around them, murmurs began to rise. A woman a few rows back leaned to whisper to her husband. A man in a suit lowered his laptop screen, eyebrows raised. Recognition spread like ripples in a still pond. The man in the plaid shirt wasn't just a quiet old traveler. He was a legend. Trevor sat back in his seat, stunned. His hands found his lap, then his knees, then rested on the armrest like he wasn't sure where they belonged anymore. His world, just moments ago built on ego and hierarchy, felt suddenly small. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "You didn't say who you were." "I didn't think I needed to," Harrison replied. Trevor swallowed hard. The earlier arrogance had drained from his face. In its place, something closer to humility began to settle in, not fully formed. "But real, I just thought you were." Trevor's voice trailed off. "Someone who didn't belong?" Harrison asked gently. Trevor didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, everyone in the cabin understood something that Trevor was just beginning to grasp. Some people don't have to announce who they are. They just carry it. And when their name is finally spoken, it doesn't elevate them. It explains everything. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, the familiar lurch of arrival rippling through the cabin. Passengers stirred, seatbacks lifted, tray tables clicked back into place. Outside, the sky hung low with late afternoon light, that golden hour where everything looked warmer, softer, almost forgiving. Trevor sat in silence, eyes fixed on the seat in front of him, hands still, jaw tight. He hadn't said a word since the attendant spoke the name, since the truth settled in like dust on a glass surface, exposing everything he hadn't seen, or refused to. Beside him, Harrison remained composed, quietly gathering his things, every movement unhurried, unbothered. He didn't look at Trevor, didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to say what hadn't been said yet. As the plane taxied to a stop, the chime for deboarding sounded. People began to rise, murmuring softly, sneaking glances toward seat 2B. Some now recognized him. Others only sensed something had happened. But no one said a word. It wasn't the time. It didn't need to be. Trevor stood, suddenly unsure of himself in a way he hadn't felt in years. He turned, clearing his throat, then turned back again, struggling for the right words. Finally, he faced Harrison. "Hey," he said quietly, barely above a whisper, I need to say something." Harrison paused, then met his eyes. Calm, waiting. "I'm sorry," Trevor said, "not because you're you." Not because I know your name now, but because I was a jerk. I judged you, treated you like someone less, and the truth is, I don't think I was ever more wrong." Harrison studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "I appreciate the apology," he said, "but more than that, I hope you take something with you." Trevor nodded. "I will." Harrison's voice softened. "Next time, don't wait to know someone's name before deciding whether they deserve your respect." Trevor felt those words land in his chest, not heavy, but deep. They moved slowly through the terminal, past polished gates and glowing signs, the crowd moving around them like a river parting for two currents no longer flowing the same direction. Outside on the tarmac, a small classic seaplane waited near the private hangars. It looked like something from another time, all silver curves and purpose. Trevor watched as Harrison made his way toward it, a mechanic greeting him with a respectful nod. No red carpet, no camera flashes, just quiet recognition from people who knew what real earned respect looked like. Harrison climbed aboard with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times, and maybe he had. The door closed. The propellers stirred. The engine hummed to life. Trevor stood just inside the terminal glass, watching. He looked down at his hands. The champagne was long gone, dried into the fabric of a jacket that suddenly felt a little too tailored, a little too empty. He closed his eyes. Richer men had flown first class, but not all of them had walked away with what he had now. And as the small plane lifted off the ground and disappeared into the wide sky, Trevor felt something new rise in its place. Not shame, something better, a beginning, because some flights change your location, others change your direction. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.